The security guard's eyes barely lifted from his clipboard as the woman approached the entrance to Joint Base Andrews. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military facility. You'll need to turn around." His tone carried that particular brand of dismissive authority reserved for civilians who'd wandered too close to something important. The woman in the faded denim jacket and worn boots didn't argue, just stood there quietly, something flickering behind her dark eyes, something that suggested she knew exactly where she was and why she belonged there. Want to know what happened when those declassified files finally surfaced after 15 years? Hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from, because this story will change how you think about following orders. Margaret Maggie Chen stood 5'6" in her weathered combat boots, the kind of practical footwear that had carried her through more countries than most people could name on a map. At 47, she bore the subtle marks of someone who'd spent years squinting against desert sun and mountain wind crow's feet that spoke of vigilance, not vanity, and hands that moved with the economical precision of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean wasted lives. Her black hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed a small scar along her left temple, barely visible unless you knew where to look. She wore civilian clothes that were functional rather than fashionable, dark jeans that had seen better days, a plain gray t-shirt under an olive drab jacket that might have once been military issue, and a simple black watch that looked like it could survive anything thrown at it. The morning heat at Joint Base Andrews was already building, that oppressive humidity of a Maryland summer that made everything feel heavier, more urgent. The smell of jet fuel hung in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of hot tarmac and the faint diesel exhaust from the convoy of vehicles that had just passed through the main gate. In the distance, the rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors provided a constant backdrop, punctuated by the occasional roar of a transport plane taking off or landing. Maggie had arrived early for her appointment at the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, a meeting she'd been trying to arrange for months regarding her service records and medical benefits. The irony wasn't lost on her that she needed permission to enter a base where she'd once held clearance levels that most of the current personnel would never achieve. The guard, a young airman first class whose name tape read Jenkins, couldn't have been more than 22. His uniform was crisp, his bearing confident in the way that only comes from never having had that confidence truly tested. Behind him, 2 other young service members emerged from the guard shack staff. Sergeant Morrison, maybe 25, with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd made rank quickly and wasn't shy about reminding people, and Airman Rodriguez, whose baby face and eager eyes marked her as someone still proving herself in her first assignment. "Look, lady," Jenkins continued, his voice taking on that patient tone adults use with confused children. "I don't know who told you that you could just walk onto a military installation, but that's not how this works. You need proper identification, an escort, and a reason to be here that doesn't involve whatever." He gestured vaguely at her civilian attire. "Whatever this is supposed to be." Morrison stepped forward, clipboard in hand, playing the role of the reasonable authority figure. "Ma'am, do you have any identification? A military ID, dependent card, anything that would authorize your presence here?" His tone suggested he already knew the answer and was going through the motions of proper procedure before turning her away. Maggie reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a standard driver's license and what appeared to be a crumpled appointment letter. "I have a 900 appointment with Major Harrison at the VA Liaison Office," she said quietly, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that might have been from California or might have been from somewhere else entirely. Rodriguez laughed, a sound that carried more nervousness than humor. "The VA office? Ma'am, that's for veterans. You know, people who actually served." She exchanged a look with Morrison that suggested they'd dealt with confused civilians before. People who thought they deserved access to military facilities for reasons that made sense only to them. "I understand the confusion. Morrison said, taking the appointment letter and glancing at it briefly before handing it back. But even if this is legitimate, you'd need a military escort to access that office. And frankly, looking at you. He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. Maggie didn't look like someone who belonged in a military environment, didn't carry herself with the bearing they expected from veterans, didn't fit their image of what service looked like. Jenkins nodded, warming to his role as the voice of authority. Yeah, I mean, no offense, but most of the female vets I know, they've got that look, you know. They carry themselves different. More military. He gestured at Maggie's relaxed posture, the way she stood with her hands loose at her sides, no hint of the parade rest or attention positions they associated with military bearing. Plus, Rodriguez added, if you'd really served, you'd know the protocol here. You'd know you can't just show up without proper authorization. It's like basic military courtesy 101. The three of them had formed a loose semicircle around Maggie, their body language making it clear that this conversation was over before it had really begun. They weren't being deliberately cruel, but their dismissal was complete, was simply someone who didn't belong, someone playing at being something she wasn't. Maggie listened to their explanations with the patience of someone who'd waded through longer briefings and more important conversations. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't point out the assumptions they were making. Instead, she simply nodded and said, I understand your position. It was Morrison who noticed at first a flash of black ink along Maggie's left forearm as she adjusted her jacket in the building heat. Hold on, he said, his voice changing slightly. What's that on your arm? Maggie glanced down, seeming to realize for the first time that her sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo. Without fanfare, she rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a detailed piece of artwork that made all three guards take a step closer. The tattoo was a unit insignia, but not one they immediately recognized, a stylized eagle with wings spread over crossed lightning bolts, surrounded by text that read, Honest Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, in small, precise lettering. Below that, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a series of numbers. 1993, 2008, and coordinates that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who knew where to look. Rodriguez's confident smirk faded. Is that? Delta Force, Jenkins whispered, his voice suddenly uncertain. But it was the smaller tattoo below the unit insignia that made Morrison's face go palia. Simple black star with the letters SIF underneath it, marking her as part of the counterintelligence force, the people who hunted spies and terrorists in places that didn't officially exist. Maggie rolled up her right sleeve as well, revealing a collection of small symbols that told a story most people would never be authorized to read: jump wings, dive bubbles, and a small crossed rifles insignia that indicated advanced marksmanship training. Along her right shoulder, barely visible through her t-shirt, they could see the edge of what looked like surgical scars, the kind that came from field medicine performed under less than ideal conditions. Sweet Jesus, Morrison breathed, his clipboard suddenly feeling heavy in his hands. The change in atmosphere was immediate and complete. Jenkins, who moments before had been explaining military protocol to someone he assumed was a confused civilian, now found himself staring at a woman whose service record was literally written on her skin. Rodriguez, who had laughed about veterans carrying themselves differently, was beginning to understand that Maggie's relaxed posture wasn't the stance of someone unfamiliar with military baronjit, was the stance of someone so comfortable with authority that she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel broke the silence that had settled over the group. Major Harrison himself was walking toward the gate, his stride purposeful and his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching alarm as he took in the scene before him. Sergeant Chen, he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of respect that comes with understanding exactly who you're addressing. I apologize for any confusion. I should have ensured you were properly escorted from the moment you arrived." The use of her former rank hit the three guards like a physical blow. Morrison's clipboard clattered to the ground as he snapped to attention, his earlier swagger evaporating completely. Jenkins and Rodriguez followed suit, their casual dismissal replaced by the rigid posture of junior personnel who suddenly realized they'd been spectacularly out of line. Major Harrison, a career officer with enough ribbons on his chest to suggest he'd seen his share of difficult situations, turned to address the guards with the kind of quiet authority that made seasoned NCOs nervous. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I believe you and your personnel may have misunderstood exactly who you were speaking with." Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he replied, "Sir, we had no way of knowing." "No way of knowing what, Sergeant?" Harrison's interruption was sharp. "No way of knowing that a woman with a confirmed appointment at this facility might actually belong here. No way of knowing that your job is to verify credentials, not make assumptions about who does or doesn't look military enough for your tastes." He turned to Jenkins and Rodriguez, both of whom looked like they wanted to disappear into the hot tarmac beneath their feet. "Airman Jenkins, Airman Rodriguez, do either of you know what a SIF insignia represents?" Rodriguez shook her head, her earlier confidence completely gone. "Counterintelligence Force," Harrison explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications. "These are the people who hunt down enemies of the United States in places where we're not supposed to have people. They work alone, often for months at a time, in countries whose names you're not cleared to know. They prevent terrorist attacks, locate stolen nuclear materials, and eliminate threats to national security that never make it to the evening news because they're stopped before they become news." Jenkins opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. "Sergeant Chen," Harrison continued, "spent 15 years in Delta Force and SIF operations. She has 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Silver Star that's still classified at a level that none of you have clearance to even know exists. She's been shot, stabbed, captured, and tortured for information she never gave up. She speaks 6 languages fluently and can kill someone with her bare hands in more ways than most people can imagine." Morrison found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "Sir, how were we supposed to know any of that?" Harrison's expression didn't soften. "You weren't supposed to know any of that, Sergeant. What you were supposed to do was treat everyone who approaches this gate with basic respect and professionalism. What you were supposed to do was verify credentials without making assumptions about who belongs in our military based on their age, gender, or civilian attire. What you were not supposed to do was turn this gate into your personal judgment panel on who looks military enough to deserve courtesy." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Sergeant Chen was stripped of her rank and discharged 15 years ago for refusing to follow direct orders during a classified operation in Afghanistan. Her commanding officer recommended court-martial proceedings. Her security clearance was revoked, her service record was flagged, and she was sent home in disgrace." The 3 guards exchanged confused glances, unsure where this story was leading. "What none of us knew," Harrison said, his voice taking on a different tone. "What couldn't be known until the files were declassified last month was that those orders she refused to follow constituted war crimes. Her commanding officer was ordering the execution of captured enemy combatants in violation of the Geneva Convention. Sergeant Chen refused, and when she threatened to report the incident, she was railroaded out of the service to protect the people giving illegal orders." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of aircraft and the steady hum of base operations continuing around them. The Pentagon review that began after declassification has resulted in the court-martial and imprisonment of her former commanding officer and 2 other personnel involved in the cover-up. Sergeant Chen's rank has been posthumously restored, posthumously, because the Army assumed she was dead. It took them 15 years to locate her and discover that she'd been working as a civilian contractor. Using skills the military taught her to continue serving her country despite how badly her country had failed her. Morrison's hands were shaking now, whether from anger at himself or fear of the consequences of his actions. It was impossible to tell. Major Harrison stepped closer to the three guards, his voice dropping to the kind of tone that made seasoned officers pay attention. So when I hear that military personnel under my command treated a decorated veteran like an unwelcome intruder, when I hear that you questioned her right to be here based on your assessment of whether she looked military enough, it makes me wonder what other assumptions you've been making and who else you've been disrespecting. Maggie, who had remained silent throughout Harrison's explanation, finally spoke up. Major, with respect, they were doing their job. They didn't have the information they needed to make an informed decision. Her intervention surprised everyone, including Harrison. Rodriguez looked at her with something approaching awe. Where was someone defending the people who had just spent 10 minutes dismissing and mocking her? They followed protocol, Maggie continued, her voice steady and without accusation. They asked for identification. They questioned someone who didn't fit their expectations, and they maintained security. The problem wasn't their procedure, it was their assumptions about what military service looks like. She turned to address the three guards directly. Jenkins, you said female veterans carry themselves differently, more military. You're not wrong, most do. But I spent 15 years learning to blend in, to not look like what I was. Looking military was a liability in my line of work. If enemy combatants could identify me as an American soldier from across a bazaar, I was already dead. Jenkins nodded, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine attention. Rodriguez, you said if I'd really served, I'd know the protocol. You're right about knowing protocol. But I also know that protocol exists to serve security, not the other way around. When protocol becomes more important than the mission, people die. She looked at Morrison last. Sergeant, you said I didn't carry myself with military bearing. That's because military bearing, like everything else in the service, is a tool. You use it when it serves the mission. In my case, the mission required me to look like someone you'd never suspect of being capable of violence. To demonstrate her point, Maggie's entire demeanor shifted. Her relaxed posture straightened into perfect military attention. Her casual expression became alert and focused, and her hands moved to a precise parade rest position. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that all three guards took an involuntary step backward. Better? She asked, and there was just a hint of humor in her voice. Ma'am, yes ma'am, Morrison replied automatically, the response drilled into him by years of training. Maggie relaxed again, returning to her earlier casual stance. The point isn't that you were wrong to question me. The point is that you made assumptions about what service looks like, about who belongs in uniform, about what dedication to the country means. Those assumptions could have been dangerous if I'd actually been a threat, and they were disrespectful because they weren't based on facts. Major Harrison stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of respect for Maggie's handling of the situation and continued displeasure with his personnel. That said, there will be consequences for what happened here today. Morrison, you and your team will be attending sensitivity training regarding assumptions about military service. You'll also be writing formal letters of apology, not to Sergeant Chen, but to the Veterans Affairs Office, explaining why their client was delayed and disrespected. Morrison nodded, his earlier swagger completely gone. Additionally, Harrison continued, all three of you will be participating in a base-wide program about recognizing and respecting diverse forms of military service. Because if you made these assumptions about Sergeant Chen, I guarantee you've made them about other veterans, other service members, other people who've earned your respect but don't fit your narrow definition of what military service looks like. He paused, making sure his words were understood. Rodriguez, Jenkins, you're both being reassigned to work with the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office for the next month. You'll be helping process claims and applications from veterans seeking benefits and recognition. Maybe spending time with people whose service took different forms than yours will help you develop a broader understanding of what it means to serve. Jenkins looked like he wanted to object, but one look at Harrison's expression told him that this wasn't a discussion. Now, Harrison said, his tone becoming more professional. Sergeant Chen, if you're ready, we have quite a bit to discuss regarding your restored benefits and the Pentagon's ongoing review of classified operations from your era of service. Maggie nodded, then turned back to the three guards one final time. One last thing, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Military service isn't a competition. It's not about who's tougher, who's seen more combat, who has more ribbons or higher clearance. It's about serving something bigger than yourself, and that service takes many forms. Some people serve by maintaining security at gates like this one. Some serve by processing paperwork that helps veterans get benefits. Some serve in ways that can never be acknowledged or recognized. She looked directly at Rodriguez. Your job is important. Keeping this base secure matters. But remember that the people you're protecting aren't just the ones in uniform. They're also the ones who used to wear uniforms, who earned the right to be here through their service, even if that service doesn't look the way you expected it to. Morrison found his voice again. Ma'am, how do we know next time? How do we avoid making the same mistakes? Maggie considered this for a moment. You ask questions instead of making assumptions. You treat everyone with basic respect while you verify their credentials. And you remember that military service changes people in different ways. Some people become more rigid, more formal, more obviously military. Others, especially those who served in certain capacities, learn to become invisible, to blend in, to not look like what they are. She gestured toward the base behind them. This place is full of people whose service you'd never recognize if you saw them on the street. The mechanic who keeps your aircraft flying might be a former Navy SEAL. The administrative assistant processing your pay might be a former Marine sniper. The janitor cleaning your offices might be a former Army Ranger who's seen more combat than most active-duty personnel ever will. Jenkins nodded slowly. So we should assume everyone might be military? No, Maggie replied. You should assume everyone deserves respect until they prove otherwise. Military service shouldn't be a prerequisite for basic human dignity. Major Harrison checked his watch. Sergeant Chen, we should head to the office. There are quite a few documents that need your signature, and several people from Washington who want to speak with you about your experiences. As they began walking toward the administrative building, Maggie turned back one final time. Rodriguez, Jenkins, Morrison, good luck with your reassignments. The Veterans Affairs Office does important work. You might find it educational. The three guards watched them go, standing in awkward silence until they were out of sight. Finally, Rodriguez spoke up. Jesus, Staff Sergeant. We really screwed that up, didn't we? Morrison nodded, his clipboard hanging forgotten in his hand. Yeah, we did. But maybe that's not the worst thing. Maybe we needed to screw up to learn something. Jenkins was still staring in the direction Maggie and Harrison had gone. Did you see how she changed? Like, completely changed when she went to attention? It was like watching someone put on a mask. That's because it was a mask, Morrison said quietly. Everything about her, the way she dressed, the way she stood, the way she talked, it was all designed to make her look like someone you wouldn't notice, someone you wouldn't suspect, someone you'd underestimate. Rodriguez shuddered slightly. And we did exactly what she wanted us to do. We underestimated her completely. The scary part, Morrison continued, is that if she'd been here to cause trouble, we would have let her walk right through. We were so busy judging her based on what we thought military service should look like that we completely missed what it actually looked like. The rest of their shift passed quietly, each of them lost in thought about assumptions, respect, and the different faces that service can wear. When their replacements arrived, Morrison made sure to brief them thoroughly, not just about procedures and protocols, but about the importance of treating everyone with respect while those procedures were followed. Word of the incident spread through the base quickly, as word always does in military communities. By evening, most personnel had heard some version of the story about the Delta Force veteran who'd been disrespected at the main gate. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core message remained the same. Assumptions about military service could be dangerous, disrespectful, and wrong. Major Harrison's promised sensitivity training became more than just punishment for 3 guards who'd made mistakes. Became a base-wide initiative to help all personnel recognize and respect the diverse faces of military service. Veterans who looked nothing like the stereotypical image of service members were brought in to share their stories. Active duty personnel learned about the different roles, missions, and experiences that shaped how military service could manifest in people's lives. The story of Sergeant Margaret Chen became something of a legend at Joint Base Andrews, not because of her classified exploits or her decorated service record, but because of how she'd handled being dismissed and disrespected by people who should have known better. She could have pulled rank, could have demanded immediate recognition, could have made the 3 guards look foolish for their assumptions. Instead, she'd used the moment as a teaching opportunity, demonstrating that true military bearing sometimes meant showing restraint, dignity, and grace under pressure. 6 months later, when Jenkins was processing a benefits application for a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who'd served as a military nurse in Vietnam, he remembered Sergeant Chen's lesson about assumptions and took the time to thank the veteran for her service. When Rodriguez was helping a young man whose leg had been amputated after an IED explosion navigate the complex paperwork required for disability benefits, she thought about how service changes people in different ways and made sure he knew that his sacrifice was recognized and valued. Morrison, now working full-time with the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, had developed a reputation for treating every veteran who walked through his door with the respect and dignity that Sergeant Chen had shown him, even when he didn't deserve it. He learned that military service was indeed not a competition, and that his job was to serve those who had served, regardless of what their service looked like or how it had changed them. The lesson that echoed through Joint Base Andrews, and eventually through other installations as the story spread, was simple but profound. Respect isn't something you earn by looking the part or fitting expectations. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do, and because you never know who you're really talking to or what they've sacrificed for their country. Military service comes in many forms, leaves many different marks on the people who undertake it, and deserves recognition regardless of whether it fits our preconceived notions of what service should look like. The quiet strength of someone like Sergeant Chen, someone who served with distinction, faced injustice with dignity, and used her experience to teach, rather than to punish, represents the best of what military service can produce. People who are strong enough to be gentle, confident enough to be humble, and secure enough in their own service to lift up others rather than tear them down. Have you ever seen someone underestimated because they didn't fit the expected image? Have you made assumptions about someone's background or capabilities based on their appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below about times when quiet strength surprised you, or when you learned not to judge by appearances. And if you know a veteran whose service doesn't fit the typical mold, take a moment to thank them, because heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. Hit that subscribe button to hear more stories about the hidden heroes among us. And remember, respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything.